I have 5 children, so I've had lots of practice with this father business. Not to say I've gotten any better at it as the years have gone on, but over the years I started to think about what we as fathers contribute to our kids. So we all know what we think we know about what fathers contribute to kids. I had when my first child was born, I worked for a real grizzled newspaper man at the Associated Press, and I was very excited and caught up in all that stuff about expecting my first child. And he said, just spend some time with them and tell them you love them. That's what matters, And I basically bought into that, and it's not bad advice at all. But I wondered from time to time whether there was more to it than that. And so it turns out I spent about 10 years on what was supposed to be a 1-year project, working on this book called Do Fathers Matter? So the question, so that was the question, do fathers matter? And it fit into what things I had done as a science reporter, which I've been doing for about 30 years now. And a lot of my work has to do with the idea that, there are things we think we know. There are things we think we know about the environment. There are things we think we know about vaccines. There are things we think we know about all kinds of things. And it's useful sometimes, particularly for those of us who are not scientists and not involved in that world, to peek into that world and see what we really know. So I hope that this kind of work in general that I've done is try to clear up misconceptions and explain why things are the way they are and so forth, and get rid of all that stuff that we carry around, a lot of which is right. If you have a strong impression of your father and what he gave to you, no science is going to challenge that. But there's a lot more that we can say. In fact, I found out there was an enormous amount of research on fathers and what they contribute to kids. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. Now, I should say that in this day and age, when fathers are becoming much more active in their children's lives, the economy has kind of thrown us all over the last 10, 15, 20 years, really beginning in the 70s, when many families felt that both parents had to work in order to support the family and do the things they wanted to do for themselves and their children. And so things have radically shifted, and we now expect a lot more from fathers. So it's easy to say, to a father who works 10 hours a day and doesn't see his kids a whole lot, it's easy to sort of dismiss that, and say, well, sure, they got a nice house, but the guy never sees his kids, So we have to be a little bit careful about that, because what is the single worst thing that can happen to children? The single worst thing that can happen to children is poverty. Okay? So fathers, before we dismiss fathers who don't spend a lot of time with their kids, let's remember that if they're providing an income and providing a home for their children and a good school or whatever they can manage, that's a very important thing. So I just thought I'd say that, because we're all now so excited about all the other things that fathers are doing, and stay-at-home dads and all these social trends. It's important to say that, dads who provide for their kids, that was a good thing 100 years ago and 200 years ago, and it's still a good thing. So that was the extent of what we knew about fathers if you go back a generation or so. So one of the things I was shocked to discover was that, in the 1970s, not exactly ancient history, if you had gone to the experts to talk about fathers and say, what do fathers, aside from this business of putting a roof over their heads, what do fathers contribute to their kids? And I don't mean if you asked me or you asked somebody at your table or something, but if you asked the experts, the leading psychologists and so forth, what do fathers do for their kids? And the answer would have been, not much. Mothers, there was the predominant theory of the family in child rearing in the 20th century was what's called attachment theory, that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. read through the literature on attachment theory. The guru of this was a guy named John Bowlby. And if you see the word father, I'd be surprised. I can't say I've read all the literature on attachment theory or made sure it wasn't there, but it's not, fathers aren't part of that theory. It's about bonding between mothers and kids, and so that was the leading theory, and so fathers weren't too important. And sadly, a lot of fathers who may not have known that research bought into that. I seem to remember much more when my first child was born around that time. There seemed to be lots of fathers who had infants or toddlers who weren't very involved, and all they could talk about was when the baby would be old enough to kick a soccer ball or put on a baseball mitt. That's what they were thinking about as fathers. Now that's good too. Playing with your kids and sports and whatever it might be is great, but as I say, there's more to it than that. So as I started to look around to see what kind of research there was on fathers' contributions, I discovered that these experts who would have told us not much were actually quite right about that. I got started on this. I went to a conference in 2005 of the Society for Research on Child Development, because I just had this notion that this was interesting, and that this would be a good place to find out about it. So there were probably, it's a big scientific conference. There were probably 1,000 or 2,000 talks, papers presented, and I think I counted 11 or 12 on fathers. So I tried to catch all those, and every one of those began with, the researchers saying, although very little research has been done on fathers, et cetera, we decided to look at fathers in this context and so forth. So somebody actually tallied this up right around that time, 2005, a psychologist at the University of South Florida pulled out 514 important studies of child and adolescent psychology. Out of those 500 studies on kids, nearly half of them had no mention of fathers. Some involved both parents, but only 11% of the studies focused exclusively on fathers. So I wasn't making this up. This was a real thing. And I ran into it early in my research with a psychologist at Columbia who did a very interesting study on depressed mothers and kids. And the idea was mothers at Columbia, the emergency room functions as a kind of primary care center for a lot of people who don't have insurance or don't have primary care physicians. You're all familiar with this phenomenon. It happens everywhere. So these researchers said, well, if we see depressed mothers in the emergency room who are coming in to get their kids vaccinated or because they have a cold or whatever it might be, I wonder if we treat the mothers, can we prevent or reduce the likelihood of depression in the kids? This builds off the attachment theory idea. Mothers and kids are closely attached. If mother's depressed, child has an increased risk of depression. So it's hard to track all these kids down, especially when they're not really showing signs of depression yet. Maybe we can treat the mothers, and that's a great way to treat the kids. And that worked. It turned out that was right. But the word father did not appear in this research paper, which was in a prominent journal. So I called her up and I said, what's the deal? I was more polite than that. I said, what the hell's going on here? There's no fathers in the study. And so she said, well, look, she immediately got defensive and said, this is a prominent person. And she immediately got very defensive and said, look, that's the study we did. That's what we had funding for. That's it. I don't want to talk to you anymore about this. So I said, okay, I'm onto something here. So think about it for a minute. You can imagine, so you have a mother with depression, which is not a good thing, and not a good thing for the kids. That we know, okay? You can imagine that in a family like this with a depressed mother, you might have a father like my old newspaper editor who says, hey, you're just going to spend time with them, who would not be terribly responsive and understanding and empathetic, maybe, to his depressed spouse or partner. So we can imagine that. We could also imagine another father who was just a much more empathetic and sort of emotional sort of person, sensitive person, who was very responsive and helpful to his depressed partner. Now, wouldn't you think there would be a difference in those kids? In other words, by not looking at what the fathers were like or what they were doing in the family, you really screw up your study, because you don't know if maybe some of those kids, you're treating the mothers, the kids get better. Maybe it's because they have great fathers. But, this person who's much smarter than I didn't decide to look at that, and not because she's not smart, it just wasn't part of the culture. And this is like, I don't know, 11 or 12 years ago. So I thought we were smarter than that by now, even before I started working on this book. So what I want to do is, and keep an eye on the time for me, is give you a little bit of the science. There will be no math. There is no PowerPoint with equations. We're good, so relax. And no quiz afterwards. But I do want to give you some of the science. And you might not remember all the details. I'm going to try to tell it in a simple way and just give you some bullet points. But if when I'm done talking, the idea you have is that, wow, that guy was right, there is a lot of science, and if you're a dad, you can kind of, say, well, boy, I'm doing a lot more than I thought I was doing. This is kind of nice. So here are some of the things. So, particularly for those fathers who don't think they can do anything with their kids until it's time for baseball or soccer, you would assume, and I would assume, and we would all assume, that while pregnancy is a nice time to get excited, fathers don't have a lot to do with things. They had something to do with it at a certain point, but once they made that contribution, pregnancy sort of unfolds and it's the mother's show, right? And she goes through all kinds of hormonal changes. I'm not going to even attempt to describe those because I know I'll be in so much trouble no matter what I say. But all those kinds of things happen, and fathers are innocent bystanders, right? They can try to be nice and buy ice cream and things like that. That's about it. It turns out now that research is showing that fathers also undergo hormonal changes during pregnancy and at the birth. Some people are nodding, so some of you have seen this, at the birth of their kids. So as men, we're all proud of our testosterone and not happy to think about whether it might be falling when we think it should be rising. But as you know, testosterone is associated in a general way with aggression and competitiveness. So it's a good thing when you are what biologists call in the period of mate seeking, right? So when you're mate seeking, you compete against other males, for the most eligible mates, and this is just biology, and we're all very familiar with that. And testosterone gives us an extra little kick, right? So when you're about to have a child, however, competition and mate seeking is not what you're primarily interested in. What you're interested in is nurturing and empathy and raising a child. Well, nobody looked for the longest time, but finally somebody looked at testosterone levels in men and found that they actually decrease during their partner's pregnancy and further decrease when the child is born. And so nobody knows why, but it's a pretty good guess, and more research will eventually answer this question, that men's biology is changing, is shifting. They no longer need to compete against other males for the task immediately at hand, but they have to be more nurturing and responsive. So very interesting, big surprise. It was known for a long time in birds, and nobody thought that this would happen in men. And I have one funny example of the kind of changes that can happen in men. Many men gain weight during their partner's pregnancy. And it might be just because there's a lot more food in the house, because mother is devouring everything in sight. I'm going to get in trouble for that one too. But it also might be because of these hormonal changes that men are actually also having a physical response. And men too, if you think about it sort of in biological terms, men also need to sort of store resources to prepare for raising a child. It's not just women in Papua. Is there anyone here from Papua New Guinea? That's not part of New England, I don't think. Okay. So in Papua New Guinea, which is in the Pacific, some men, while waiting for their babies to be born, retire to bed with unremitting nausea and incapacitating back problems, demand to be looked after, and otherwise raise an emotional fuss during the last months of their wives' pregnancies. Now, if that's what you have to do to get a little time off work, that's okay with me. but it seems a little extreme. But anyway, something is going on there. Something very interesting and unexpected is going on with men's hormones. Men have hormones too. So, pardon me while I just skip a bit because I don't want to go over time. Okay, so one important fact to note. So we have all this new research on fatherhood, which I'm about to tell you more about. This is coming to light at a time when fewer American fathers are participating in the lives of their children than ever before. Now I've checked this, and you tell me if you've seen anything to the contrary, because it seems unbelievable. But between 1/4 and 1/2 of American children of divorced parents, between 1/4 and 1/2 of them, depending on which study you look at, never or almost never see their kids. Okay, so, I'm sorry, children of divorced parents never or almost never see their fathers. Okay, so that, 1/4 to 1/2, that's huge. And the more we learn about the importance of fathers for kids, the more important that becomes. And I'll say a little bit about divorce at the end, or remind me if I don't. So this business of fathers and mothers, I'm going to take in part an evolutionary perspective here, and we're all animals, and we're unusual animals in some respects. We're unusual in a lot of respects you know about. Beavers don't have conferences in Rhode Island, but there are other differences too, and that is that most mammals, 95% of mammals, the father has only the briefest fleeting encounter with fatherhood. Okay, so he makes his genetic contribution and he's gone. So we're very unusual in that respect. There are even animals like voles. I'm not sure, a vole is a little rodent, and that's probably as far as we need to go on that one. But there are two kinds of voles. There are mountain voles and prairie voles that live in California. And some miserable graduate student 30 years ago tracked these things around because he was desperate for a degree, and went out in the rain and weather like this, and what he discovered was that, I'm going to get this wrong now, that I forget which is which, but the two voles differed in one very important respect. In one case, they were very, very nurturing and protective fathers. They hovered when the researchers in the lab would present some kind of a threat, a bright light, or tapping the cage. They would hover over the pups and do everything that you would imagine an animal might do. The other voles, nothing. The father tries to get out of the cage. And the hell with the pups. You're on your own, fellas. So, dramatic difference. They're almost identical in every other respect, but very different. So this idea of nurturing fathers, which we take for granted, is actually unusual among animals, and it goes back about 3 million years. And we know that because there's fossil evidence that shows males and females together. They died together and their bones are together. So it's been around a long time. So generally when something's been around a long time, it's important. Okay, that's one premise, and there's a lot of evolutionary biology on this. There's one very interesting group I'm not the only one to say this, but in my book I call them the best fathers in the world. It's a group of pygmies called the Aka, AKA, that live in Central Africa. And they are hunters and gatherers. They trap. When they go out to trap, the whole family goes, wives and kids, and everybody goes to help. Everybody has a job to do. And these fathers, there's a guy named Barry Hewitt at the University of Washington who spent 20 or 30 years studying them, got so entranced with these people that he built himself a house in Africa for him to go, and he now spends months every year living with these folks. It's not just science for him anymore. They spend 90% of their day, the Aka fathers, within arm's reach of their children. So, and when they go out for drinks on Friday night, which means into a little gathering place for palm wine, they take the kids on their hip, And I can't resist saying that if the kids have a little accident when they're on their dad's hip, the dad grabs a leaf, wipes it off, and continues jabbering with the guys about what happened at work that day. So in many respects, best fathers, they spend a lot of time with their kids. And these kinds of things, excuse me, remind us that the way we do things and the way we live is only one way to do it. There are lots of other ways in different cultures.